Thomas Brennan sat at his wooden desk, the oil lamp flickering beside him as the Wyoming wind howled outside. His rough, calloused hands held a pen that felt foreign and awkward. Writing had never been his strong suit. He was a man of action, of hard work, of building something from nothing. But tonight he was doing something he never thought he'd do. He was writing a letter to a matrimonial agency in Boston, asking them to find him a wife. The year was 1887, and Thomas was 34 years old. His face was weathered from years under the brutal sun, his hands scarred from ranch work, his back strong but often aching. He owned 2,000 acres of prime grazing land, had nearly 300 head of cattle, and a sturdy ranch house that he'd built with his own 2 hands. By frontier standards, he was a successful man. But success meant nothing when you came home every night to an empty house, cooked your own meals in silence, and talked to your horse more than any human being. He looked around the room. Everything was functional but cold. There were no curtains on the windows, no pictures on the walls, no warmth anywhere, just bare wood and necessity. This wasn't a home. It was just a place to sleep between long days of back-breaking work. Thomas had tried to convince himself that he didn't need anyone. For years he told himself that solitude was freedom, that depending on no one meant no one could disappoint you. But lately the silence had become unbearable. He'd watch his ranch hands ride off to town on Saturday nights, laughing and joking about the girls they'd dance with. He'd see families at the general store, children tugging at their mother's skirts, fathers ruffling their sons' hair. And he'd feel something hollow open up inside his chest. The truth was, he hadn't always been alone. He had a sister once, Margaret, little Maggie with the wild red hair and fierce spirit. She'd been 12 years younger than him, and after their parents died when she was just 18, he'd done his best to look after her. But Maggie had other ideas. She fell in love with a fancy-talking Easterner named Robert Hartley, a man who'd come west with big dreams and empty pockets. Thomas had tried to warn her. He'd told her that Robert was all talk and no substance, that he'd take her away from everything she knew and leave her with nothing. They'd fought bitterly about it. Thomas could still remember the anger in her eyes when she told him he wasn't her father and couldn't control her life. She married Robert anyway, and they left for Boston together. That was 15 years ago. Thomas had been so angry, so hurt by what he saw as betrayal, that when she wrote to him those first few years, he never answered. Eventually, the letters stopped coming. He told himself he didn't care. He told himself she'd made her choice. But on nights like this, when the wind screamed across the plains and the loneliness pressed down on him like a physical weight, he wondered about her. Was she happy? Did she have children? Did she ever think about the ranch, about Wyoming, about him? He'd never know now. Too much time had passed. Too much pride stood in the way. Thomas shook his head, pushing thoughts of Margaret aside. That chapter was closed. He needed to focus on the future, not the past. He dipped his pen in the ink and continued writing. The matrimonial agency had specific questions. What kind of woman was he looking for? What could he offer? What were his expectations? He wrote slowly, carefully. He needed someone strong, he explained. Someone who wouldn't wilt at the first sign of hardship. Wyoming winters could kill the unprepared, and summer brought its own challenges with drought and heat. He needed someone who could cook and clean, certainly, but also someone who could handle a rifle if necessary, who could help with ranch work when needed, who understood that life out here wasn't easy or romantic. But he also wanted something more. He wanted conversation. He wanted someone to share meals with, someone to talk to about the day's events, someone who'd make this house feel less like a tomb. He wasn't looking for grand romance or passionate love. He was too old and too practical for those fairy tales. He just wanted a companion, a partner, someone to walk beside him through whatever years remained. Thomas included details about his property, his finances, his age. He tried to be honest without being discouraging. Yes, the ranch was isolated. The nearest town was 12 miles away, and it wasn't much of a town anyway. Just a general store, a saloon, a church, and a scattering of houses. There were no theaters, no fancy restaurants, no culture or society. There were harsh winters where you might not see another soul for weeks. There were dust storms, blizzards, droughts, and all manner of hardships. But there was also beauty. Endless sky that seemed to go on forever. Sunsets that painted the world in colors he couldn't name. The satisfaction of building something lasting. Of watching calves grow into strong cattle. of knowing every acre of land like the back of his hand. There was freedom here, space to breathe, a life without the crowding and noise of eastern cities. He finished the letter and read it over 3 times, crossing out words, adding others, trying to strike the right tone, not too desperate but honest about his loneliness. Not too demanding, but clear about what life here would entail. He wanted no misunderstandings, no false expectations. Whoever answered this advertisement needed to know exactly what she was getting into. Thomas pulled out his small savings box and counted out money for the bank draft. The matrimonial agency charged a fee for their services, and it wasn't cheap. But what else did he have to spend money on? He didn't drink much, didn't gamble, didn't have expensive tastes. If this money could buy him a chance at companionship, at ending these lonely years, it was worth every penny. He found his only photograph, taken 2 years ago when a traveling photographer had passed through. In it, Thomas stood stiffly in his best clothes, his face serious, his eyes squinting slightly against the sun. He looked stern, he knew, maybe even harsh, but it was an honest picture. He wasn't a young man anymore, wasn't handsome in any conventional sense. His face was too weathered, his features too rough. But he was solid, dependable, real. Thomas sealed everything in an envelope and addressed it carefully. Tomorrow he'd ride into town and send it off. And then he'd wait. The agency had said it could take months to find a suitable match. Months of continuing this lonely existence, of wondering if anyone would want this life he was offering. As he climbed into bed that night, Thomas felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Maybe it was foolish hope, maybe nothing would come of this, but for the first time in a very long time, the future seemed like it might hold something more than just endless days of solitary work. He closed his eyes and imagined a woman's voice in this house, the smell of cooking that someone else had prepared, the simple pleasure of saying goodnight to another person. He had no way of knowing that his letter would set in motion a chain of events that would turn his world completely upside down. He had no idea that the woman who would arrive at his ranch wasn't a stranger at all. He couldn't imagine that the past he'd tried so hard to bury was about to come knocking at his door in the most unexpected way possible. Thomas Brennan fell asleep that night thinking about his future. He never once suspected that his past was already making plans to find him. Margaret Brennan Hartley's fingers were sore from pushing the needle through thick fabric all morning. She sat in a cramped corner of Mrs. Peterson's dress shop in Boston, hemming a wealthy woman's evening gown. The work was tedious and the pay was barely enough to keep her and her daughter fed. But it was honest work, and these days that was all she could ask for. It was her lunch break, and Margaret had stepped out to the street vendor to buy a small sandwich to split with her 8-year-old daughter. Lucy. They couldn't afford 2 full meals, so they'd learned to share everything. Lucy was at school right now, probably hungry, counting down the minutes until she could come to the shop and eat her half. The thought made Margaret's heart ache. 2 years had passed since Robert died. 2 years since the fever took him and left her with nothing but debts and a child to feed. Robert had been charming and well-spoken, everything Thomas had warned her he wasn't. Her brother had been right about him, though she'd never admit it out loud. Robert had dreamed big but worked little. He'd moved them from boarding house to boarding house, always one step ahead of landlords demanding rent. When he died, Margaret discovered they owned nothing. Not a stick of furniture, not a single possession of value. She'd sold her wedding ring to pay for his burial. Then she'd taken the first job she could find, sewing in a shop where the owner worked his employees from dawn to dusk. Lucy had to grow up fast, learning to entertain herself in the corner of the shop after school, staying quiet so Mrs. Peterson wouldn't complain. It was no life for a child, Margaret knew. But what choice did she have? As she ate her sandwich slowly, trying to make it last, Margaret picked up a discarded newspaper someone had left on the bench. She usually avoided newspapers. They were full of a world she couldn't afford to be part of anymore. But today something made her flip through the pages. Maybe it was boredom. Maybe it was the need to think about something other than her aching fingers and empty stomach. She turned to the back pages, where the smaller advertisements ran. Situations wanted, rooms to let, business opportunities, and then near the bottom, the matrimonial advertisements. Women seeking husbands, men seeking wives. She'd seen these sections before, had always thought them rather sad, desperate even. Imagine being so alone that you'd advertise for a spouse like you were selling a horse. But today one advertisement caught her eye and held it. Her sandwich dropped from her fingers. Thomas Brennan, rancher, 34 years of age, seeks a capable wife for his Wyoming cattle ranch. Must be hardworking, practical, and willing to embrace frontier life. Ranch is prosperous but isolated. Seeking a true partner for an honest life. Serious inquiries only. Margaret's hand shook as she held the newspaper. Thomas. Her brother Thomas. It had to be him. How many Thomas Brennans could there be with ranches in Wyoming? And that was definitely their ranch. Their father's homestead that Thomas had spent his whole life building up. Tears blurred her vision. Thomas was alive. Thomas was still on the ranch. And Thomas was so lonely that he was advertising for a mail-order bride. The brother who'd once been surrounded by friends, who'd been the strongest, most self-sufficient person she knew, was now so desperate for companionship that he'd turned to strangers. What had happened to him? Why was he alone? Margaret's mind raced through possibilities. Maybe he'd never married. Maybe he'd lost someone. Maybe the isolation of ranch life had driven everyone away. But knowing her brother, she suspected the real reason was simpler and more painful. Thomas had always been proud, stubborn, fiercely independent. He probably pushed people away without even meaning to, just like he'd pushed her away 15 years ago. Except she'd pushed him away too, hadn't she? She'd chosen Robert over Thomas's warnings. She'd married a man her brother disapproved of and left Wyoming without looking back. Well, she had looked back in her heart, but pride had kept her from admitting her mistakes. Pride and shame. After Robert died, she'd written to Thomas twice. She'd swallowed her pride and reached out to the brother she'd fought with so bitterly. The letters were carefully written, explaining that she was a widow now, that she had a daughter, that she was struggling in Boston. She hadn't asked for money or help, just reconnection, just family. The letters had gone unanswered. Margaret had sent them to the ranch, to the only address she knew. When months passed with no reply, she'd assumed Thomas wanted nothing to do with her, that he was still angry about their fight, still bitter that she'd chosen Robert. Or maybe he'd just moved on with his life and didn't care to dig up old family drama. So she'd stopped writing. She'd focused on survival, on keeping Lucy fed and sheltered. She'd tried to forget she even had a brother out there somewhere. But now, staring at this advertisement, a wild idea began to form in Margaret's mind. It was crazy, absolutely insane. But desperation makes people consider crazy things. What if she answered the advertisement? What if she applied to be Thomas's mail-order bride? Not as his bride, of course. That was ridiculous. But as a way to get back to Wyoming, to get back to family, to give Lucy a better life than this endless poverty in Boston. Once she arrived, once Thomas saw her face to face, surely blood would be thicker than old grudges. Surely he wouldn't turn away his own sister and niece, or would he? Margaret knew it was risky. Thomas had a temper and a stubborn streak a mile wide. He might be furious at the deception. He might send her right back to Boston. But what did she have to lose? Her current life was barely life at all. She and Lucy were one bad winter away from the poorhouse. She was exhausted, her health failing from long hours and poor food. Lucy deserved better. She deserved open skies and fresh air and a chance at a real childhood. And maybe, just maybe, Thomas needed them as much as they needed him. The fact that he was advertising for a bride meant he was lonely, truly lonely. Maybe he regretted their fight as much as she did. Maybe he'd never received her letters. Addresses could be wrong, mail could be lost. Maybe he thought she wanted nothing to do with him. The more Margaret thought about it, the more the plan took shape in her mind. She'd answer the advertisement using her married name, Mrs. M. Hartley. She wouldn't lie about having a daughter. That wouldn't be right, and besides, Thomas would need to know. But she wouldn't mention Wyoming, wouldn't mention anything that would connect her to Thomas's past. She'd present herself as exactly what he was looking for, a widow, practical and hardworking, willing to embrace frontier life, which was all true. Once she arrived at the ranch, once she stepped off that stagecoach, then she'd reveal who she really was, face to face with nowhere to hide. They'd have to confront their past. They'd have to decide if family meant anything anymore. That evening, after Lucy had eaten her half of the sandwich and fallen asleep in the corner of the shop, Margaret began writing her letter. She wrote it by the dim light of a single candle, choosing each word carefully. She described herself honestly. A 32-year-old widow with a young daughter, experienced in running a household, comfortable with hard work, not afraid of isolation or hardship. She mentioned that she'd grown up in the West and knew what frontier life demanded. That much was true even if she didn't specify which part of the West. She explained that she wanted a stable home for her daughter, a chance at a real life. She said she wasn't looking for romance or passion, but partnership and mutual respect. She wanted to contribute, to work alongside her husband, to build something lasting. As she wrote, Margaret's guilt grew. This was deception, plain and simple. Thomas was expecting a stranger, not his estranged sister. But she pushed the guilt aside. Desperate times called for desperate measures. Once they were together again, once they had a chance to talk properly, everything would work out. It had to. She sealed the letter and addressed it to the matrimonial agency listed in the advertisement. Tomorrow she'd post it before she lost her nerve. Then she'd wait and pray that the agency would accept her application, that Thomas would agree to the match, that somehow this insane plan would work. Margaret looked over at Lucy, sleeping peacefully despite the uncomfortable position. Her daughter deserved so much more than this. She deserved family, stability, a home that wasn't a rented room above a dress shop. She deserved to know her uncle, to run on open land, to be a child instead of a quiet little shadow trying not to disturb anyone. And Thomas, whether he knew it or not, needed them too. He needed family to warm that cold ranch house. He needed a sister to forgive him and to be forgiven. He needed to know that blood mattered, that family was worth fighting for, even after 15 years of silence. Margaret closed her eyes and imagined Wyoming. She imagined seeing Thomas again, older now, probably grayer, maybe harder around the edges, but still her big brother underneath it all. She imagined his face when he recognized her. Would it be anger she saw there? Shock, or maybe, just maybe, relief? She'd find out soon enough. For better or worse, she was going home. 3 weeks later, Margaret received a response from the matrimonial agency. Her hands trembled as she opened the envelope in the tiny room she rented above the dress shop. Lucy was at school, thank goodness. Margaret needed to read this alone, needed to process whatever it said without her daughter watching her reaction. The letter was formal but positive. The agency had reviewed her application and found her to be a suitable candidate. They had forwarded her information to Mr. Thomas Brennan, who had responded with interest. Mr. Brennan appreciated her honesty about having a child and understood the challenges of frontier life. He was willing to proceed with the arrangement if she was still interested. Margaret's heart hammered in her chest. Thomas had said yes. He'd agreed to marry a widow with a child, not knowing that widow was his own sister. The deception was working, but guilt washed over her in waves. This wasn't right. She knew it wasn't right, but she'd come too far to turn back now. The agency's letter continued with practical details. Mr. Brennan would send money for train fare and stagecoach passage. The journey would take approximately 2 weeks, with several changes of trains and a final stagecoach ride from the railroad town to his ranch. He suggested she bring warm clothing, practical dresses, and anything she considered essential, though he noted the ranch was well supplied with basic necessities. There was also a note, apparently written by Thomas himself and included by the agency. Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she read her brother's words, not knowing they were meant for her. "I want to be clear about what you're coming to." The note read in Thomas's careful handwriting. "This is not an easy life. Winters are brutal, and you may not see another woman for months at a time. The work is hard, the isolation is real, and there are no fancy entertainments or social gatherings like you might be used to in the city. But the land is beautiful. The sky goes on forever, and there's satisfaction in building something real. I'm not looking for a servant or a decoration. I'm looking for a partner, someone who can stand beside me and face whatever comes. If that sounds like something you can do, then I'll do my best to make sure you never regret coming. Your daughter will be welcomed here. I'll treat her as my own." Margaret pressed the letter to her chest and sobbed quietly. Thomas's words were so achingly familiar. That was exactly how he'd always been, direct, honest, protective. He'd treat Lucy as his own. Of course he would. Thomas had helped raise Margaret after their parents died. He knew how to care for a child, how to be gentle despite his rough exterior. But he didn't know he'd written that promise to his own niece. He didn't know the child he'd agreed to raise was his own blood. Margaret's guilt deepened, but so did her determination. This was the right thing to do. Once Thomas saw them, once he understood why she'd done this, he'd forgive her. He had to. Over the next 2 weeks, Margaret prepared for the journey. She gave her notice at the dress shop enduring Mrs. Peterson's complaints about losing a skilled worker. She sold what little furniture they had, packed their clothes into a single worn trunk, and saved every penny of the money Thomas had sent. She might need it if things went wrong, if Thomas refused to take them in. The hardest part was explaining it to Lucy. Her daughter was smart, curious, always asking questions. Margaret sat her down one evening and tried to explain in terms an 8-year-old could understand. "We're going on an adventure," Margaret said, smoothing Lucy's dark hair. "We're going to Wyoming, where I grew up. There's a man there, a rancher, who needs help running his home. We're going to live on his ranch." "Is he going to be my new father?" Lucy asked, her eyes wide. Margaret hesitated. "It's complicated, sweetheart. He's family, actually. He's my brother, your uncle, but he doesn't know we're coming. It's going to be a surprise, a good surprise or a bad surprise?" Lucy asked with a child's directness. "I hope it's a good surprise," Margaret said honestly, "but he might be angry at first. We had a fight a long time ago before you were born. I'm hoping he'll forgive me." Lucy thought about this seriously. "If he's your brother and my uncle, he has to forgive you. That's what family does." Margaret hugged her daughter tight, wishing life were as simple as an 8-year-old believed. But maybe Lucy was right. Maybe blood really was thicker than old grudges. Maybe family really did have to forgive. The train journey west was long and exhausting. They traveled for days, watching the landscape change from crowded cities to open plains. Lucy pressed her face to the window, amazed by the endless sky, the herds of cattle, the vast emptiness. She'd never seen anything like it, having spent her entire life in Boston's cramped streets. "Is it all like this?" Lucy asked. "So big and empty?" "The ranch is even bigger," Margaret said. "You can ride a horse all day and not reach the end of the property. There are cattle and wide open spaces and a sky so huge you feel tiny underneath it." "I can't wait," Lucy breathed. And Margaret felt a surge of hope. At least Lucy would love it there. Even if Thomas rejected them, even if they had to leave, at least Lucy would have this memory of open land and endless possibilities. As they got closer to Wyoming, Margaret's anxiety grew. She rehearsed what she'd say 100 times in her head. "Thomas, it's me. I know you're surprised, but please let me explain." Or maybe, "I'm sorry for deceiving you, but I had no other choice." Nothing sounded right. Everything sounded like excuses. She'd look at the other passengers on the train and wonder what they'd think if they knew her story. A woman traveling west to meet a mail-order groom who didn't know he was her brother. It sounded like something from a ridiculous dime novel, but it was her life, her desperate gamble, her only hope. The final stagecoach ride from the railroad town to Thomas's ranch took an entire day. Margaret and Lucy were the only passengers, cramped in the small coach with their trunk tied to the top. The driver was a weathered old man who didn't speak much, which was a relief. Margaret didn't think she could make small talk right now. Her stomach was in knots, her hands wouldn't stop shaking. "Are you nervous, Mama?" Lucy asked, picking up on her mother's tension. "Very nervous," Margaret admitted. "But it's going to be okay. No matter what happens, we're together, and that's what matters." As the stagecoach rattled across the Wyoming plains, Margaret stared out at familiar landmarks. That ridge in the distance, she'd climbed it as a girl. That creek bed, she'd waded in it during summer. This was her home, the land she'd been born to, the place she never should have left. And then in the distance, she saw it. The ranch house Thomas had built, larger now than she remembered, with corrals and outbuildings surrounding it. Smoke rose from the chimney. Cattle dotted the nearby hills. It looked prosperous, well-maintained, exactly like something Thomas would create through sheer determination and hard work. "Is that it?" Lucy asked excitedly. "Is that the ranch?" "That's it," Margaret whispered, her throat tight. "That's home." The stagecoach slowed as they approached the main house. Margaret could see a figure standing on the porch waiting. Thomas. Even from a distance, she'd know that tall, solid frame anywhere. He'd gotten older. She could see that even from here. His hair was lighter, probably gray now. His shoulders seemed broader, or maybe just more burdened. The stagecoach stopped. The driver climbed down to open the door and help them out. This was it. This was the moment. Margaret took a deep breath, squeezed Lucy's hand, and stepped out of the coach. She looked up at the porch and her eyes met Thomas's. For one eternal second, they just stared at each other. She saw the confusion on his face, then recognition, then shock, then something that might have been anger or might have been pain. She couldn't tell. "Hello, Thomas," she said softly, her voice barely carrying across the dusty yard. "It's me. I'm home." The silence that followed felt like it lasted forever. The wind whistled across the plains. The horses stamped their feet, and Thomas just stood there, frozen, staring at the sister he hadn't seen in 15 years. The sister who was supposed to be a stranger. The sister who'd just stepped out of the coach where his mail-order bride should have been. Finally, he spoke. Just one word, barely more than a whisper, but Margaret heard it clearly. "Maggie," and in that single word she heard everything. Shock, confusion, anger, hurt, and underneath it all, something that might have been hope. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. She opened her mouth to explain, to apologize, to somehow make this right. But before she could say anything, Lucy stepped forward, looking up at the tall man on the porch with curious, fearless eyes. "Are you Uncle Thomas?" she asked brightly. "I'm Lucy. Mama says you're going to let us live here. She says you have horses I can learn to ride." And just like that, with a child's innocent question, the tension broke. Thomas's eyes moved from Margaret to Lucy, and something in his face softened. He looked at this little girl with her mother's red hair and her father's dark eyes, and Margaret saw her brother's expression change. Whatever happened next, whatever words they'd exchange, whatever anger or forgiveness would come, Lucy had already bridged the gap. Family, as it turned out, really did matter, even when it arrived unexpectedly. Even when it came wrapped in deception and old grudges, family still mattered. Thomas slowly walked down the porch steps, his eyes never leaving them. And Margaret waited, her heart in her throat, for whatever came next. Thomas felt like the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. One moment he'd been nervously waiting for a stranger who might become his wife. The next moment his sister stood in front of him. His sister, Maggie. After 15 years of silence, after convincing himself he didn't care, after building walls so high he thought nothing could break through them, and she'd come as his mail-order bride. The audacity of it hit him like a physical blow. The deception, the manipulation. She'd read his advertisement, his desperate plea for companionship, and instead of just writing to him as his sister, instead of being honest, she'd pretended to be a stranger. She'd made him hope for a new beginning, all while knowing exactly who she was. "What kind of trick is this?" Thomas heard himself say, his voice rough and cold. He saw Margaret flinch, saw the little girl Lucy press closer to her mother's side. Suddenly uncertain, the stagecoach driver was looking between them with obvious confusion, clearly sensing drama but not understanding it. "Mr. Brennan? Is everything all right? This is the lady from Boston, isn't it? The one you were expecting? Just leave the trunk on the porch," Thomas said, not taking his eyes off Margaret. "I'll pay you extra for your trouble." The driver seemed happy to take his money and leave quickly. He unloaded the trunk, accepted the coins Thomas handed him without counting them, and drove off faster than necessary. Smart man. Anyone could see a storm was brewing here. When the sound of the stagecoach faded into the distance, an uncomfortable silence fell over the yard. Ranch hands were watching from the barn, pretending to work but clearly curious about the new arrivals. Thomas ignored them. His entire focus was on the woman standing in front of him, this stranger who was somehow also the little sister he'd once protected from everything. Except she wasn't little anymore. Margaret was 32 now, a grown woman with lines of hardship on her face. She looked thin, too thin, and exhausted in a way that went deeper than the long journey. Her dress was shabby but clean, mended in several places with careful stitches. Her hands, he noticed, were rough and red, the hands of someone who'd worked hard for every penny. And the child, his niece, he realized with a jolt. This was his niece. Lucy had Margaret's red hair but darker eyes, probably from her father. Robert's eyes. The child looked healthy but had that same thin quality as her mother, as if regular meals hadn't always been guaranteed. "Thomas," Margaret started, her voice shaking. "I know you're angry. I know this isn't what you expected. But please let me explain." "Explain?" Thomas interrupted, his anger flaring hot and bright. "Explain what, Maggie? Explain why you lied? Explain why you answered a matrimonial advertisement instead of just writing to your brother like a normal person? Explain why you made me think—" He stopped himself, not wanting to admit how much hope he'd invested in this arrival. "What gave you the right to play games with me like this?" "I wasn't playing games," Margaret said. lifting her chin in that stubborn way he remembered so well. I wrote to you, Thomas. 2 years ago after Robert died. I wrote twice, told you I was a widow, told you I was struggling. You never answered. That stopped him cold. What are you talking about? I never got any letters from you. I sent them to the ranch, Margaret insisted. Same address I'd always known. I waited months for a reply. When none came, I thought you'd decided you wanted nothing to do with me, that you were still angry about Robert, about me leaving. Thomas's mind raced. 2 years ago. He'd been dealing with a brutal winter that year, had lost several cattle, had been snowed in for weeks at a time. Mail had been sporadic, and he'd moved the main ranch operations to the north pasture for a season while repairing the house. Letters could have gone astray, could have been lost, could have sat in the town post office until they were returned as undeliverable. I never got them, he said again, but with less certainty now. I didn't even know Robert had died. I didn't know about... He looked at Lucy, who was watching him with wide, uncertain eyes. I didn't know about her. Her name is Lucy, Margaret said softly. She's 8 years old. And she's your niece, Thomas. Your family. Just like I'm your family, whether you want me or not. Family. The word hit him hard, because that was what his advertisement had really been about, wasn't it? Not romance or passion or even companionship in any conventional sense. He'd been looking for family, for someone to share this vast empty space with, for someone who'd make this ranch feel like more than just a business. And here was his actual family standing in his yard, having traveled 2,000 miles to find him. But the anger didn't disappear just because he understood the situation better. If anything, it grew more complicated, tangled up with hurt and confusion and old wounds that had never properly healed. You still lied, Thomas said stubbornly. You could have written to the agency and told them who you were. You could have contacted me directly. Instead, you deceived me. You let me think I was getting a wife, a fresh start, when really I was getting the past I tried to leave behind. Is that what I am to you? Margaret's voice broke. The past you tried to leave behind? Is that all your sister means to you? You're the one who left. Thomas shot back. You're the one who chose that smooth-talking fool over your own family. You're the one who married him knowing I disapproved, knowing it would hurt me. You made your choice 15 years ago, Maggie. You can't just show up now and expect everything to be like it was before. Lucy started crying then, quiet tears running down her cheeks. Mama, I don't like it here. He's mean. Let's go back. The sight of the child's tears did something to Thomas's anger. It didn't erase it, but it complicated it further. This wasn't Lucy's fault. None of this was the child's fault. She was just a little girl who'd traveled across the country to a place her mother had promised would be home. Margaret knelt down and hugged her daughter. It's okay, sweetheart. Uncle Thomas is just surprised. He's not really mean. He's just confused right now. I want to go home, Lucy sobbed. I want to go back to Boston. We can't, baby, Margaret said, and Thomas heard the desperation in her voice. We don't have a home in Boston anymore. This is home now. This has to be home. Something in those words pierced through Thomas's anger. They didn't have a home in Boston. Margaret had burned her bridges to come here, had used all the money he'd sent on this journey. Looking at her shabby dress, her thin frame, her work-worn hands, Thomas suddenly understood. This wasn't a game or a trick. This was desperation. His sister was desperate, probably had been desperate for a long time. He thought about the advertisement he'd written, about how he'd described the kind of woman he was looking for. Strong, capable, willing to face hardship, not afraid of hard work. Looking at Margaret now, he realized she fit that description perfectly. She'd always been strong, even as a girl. She'd survived losing her parents, survived a marriage that had clearly been difficult, survived widowhood and poverty in a city far from home. She'd raised a child alone, worked hard enough to wear her hands raw, and still had the courage to gamble everything on a chance at coming home. Maybe the deception was wrong. Probably it was wrong, but maybe, just maybe, Thomas could understand why she'd done it. Come inside, he said finally, his voice gruff. It's getting cold. Lucy, are you hungry? Lucy peeked out from her mother's embrace, wiping her tears with her sleeve. A little bit, she admitted quietly. I've got stew on the stove, Thomas said. Made it this morning. It's not fancy, but it's hot and there's plenty. He looked at Margaret. We're going to talk about this. We're going to have a long conversation about what happened, about what happens next. But first you both need to eat and rest. You've traveled a long way. Margaret stood up slowly, holding Lucy's hand. "Thank you," she whispered. "Don't thank me yet," Thomas said. "We haven't figured anything out. I don't even know if you're staying." "We're staying," Margaret said with quiet determination. "I'm not leaving again, Thomas. Not unless you physically drag me off this property. I came home and I'm staying home." Thomas looked at his sister, really looked at her. 15 years had changed them both. They weren't the young people who'd fought so bitterly over Robert. They were adults now, marked by life and loss and loneliness. Maybe that meant they could find a way forward that younger. More stubborn versions of themselves couldn't have managed. Or maybe they'd just fight even more bitterly, with 15 years of silence adding fuel to the fire. "Come on," Thomas said, picking up their trunk like it weighed nothing. "Let's get you inside before we freeze out here." He led them up the porch steps and through the door into the ranch house. Margaret stopped just inside, looking around at the bare walls, the functional furniture, the complete lack of warmth or decoration. Thomas suddenly saw his home through her eyes and felt embarrassed by how cold and empty it looked. "It's not much," he muttered. "It's more than we had in Boston," Margaret said quietly. Then she looked at him directly. "I'm sorry for deceiving you, Thomas. I truly am, but I'm not sorry for coming. And I'm not sorry for bringing Lucy to meet her uncle. Family is family, no matter how much time has passed. I still believe that, even if you don't." Thomas didn't answer. He just ladled stew into bowls and set them on the table, along with fresh bread he'd bought in town yesterday. He watched as Lucy ate like she was starving. After they ate, Thomas showed Margaret and Lucy to the spare bedroom. It was small but clean, with a decent bed and a window that looked out over the eastern pasture. Lucy was exhausted from the journey and fell asleep almost immediately, still wearing her travel clothes curled up on top of the blankets. Margaret covered her daughter gently, then turned to find Thomas standing in the doorway watching them. The anger was still there in his eyes, but it had cooled somewhat. Now it was mixed with something else. Confusion, maybe. Or pain. "We need to talk," he said quietly so as not to wake Lucy. Outside, Margaret followed him out to the porch. The sun was setting, painting the Wyoming sky in shades of orange and pink that she'd forgotten existed. Boston had sunsets, but they were nothing like this. Nothing could compete with the vast openness of the plains, where the sky seemed to go on forever in every direction. They stood side by side at the porch railing, not looking at each other, both staring out at the land. For a few minutes neither spoke. The silence wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't entirely hostile either. It was the silence of two people trying to figure out where to start. "You said Robert died 2 years ago," Thomas finally said. "What happened?" "Fever," Margaret replied simply. "It swept through Boston that winter. Took a lot of people. Robert was one of them." "Were you?" Thomas hesitated. "Were you happy with him?" Margaret considered the question. She could lie, could protect her pride, could pretend that her choice to leave had been worth it. But what was the point now? "No," she admitted. "You were right about him, Thomas. He was all talk and no substance. He had big dreams but never stuck with anything long enough to make them real. We moved constantly, always one step ahead of debt collectors. He was charming and I loved him, but he was never practical, never responsible." "I tried to warn you," Thomas said, and there was no satisfaction in his voice. "Just sadness, I know you did, and I was too young and too stubborn to listen. I thought you were trying to control me, trying to keep me from living my own life. I thought I knew better." Margaret's voice cracked. "I was such a fool." "You were 18, Thomas said quietly. "We're all fools at 18. They fell silent again. Margaret wrapped her arms around herself, though she wasn't really cold. The weight of 15 years of silence pressed down on her shoulders. "Why didn't you write to me?" she finally asked. After I married Robert. I wrote to you several times those first few years. You never answered a single letter." "I was angry," Thomas admitted. "So angry, Maggie. You were all the family I had left, and you chose him over me. It felt like you were saying I wasn't enough. That the home I'd tried to build for us, the life I'd worked so hard to give you, none of it mattered because some smooth-talking Easterner showed up and turned your head." "That's not fair," Margaret protested. "I didn't choose Robert over you. I chose to get married, to have my own life." "That's what people do, Thomas. They grow up and leave home. It doesn't mean they don't love their family." "But you didn't just leave home," Thomas said, his voice rising. "You left the state, left the territory, Went all the way to Boston with a man I knew was going to let you down, and when I tried to stop you, when I told you what I thought, you told me to mind my own business. You said I was jealous and controlling. You said a lot of things that hurt, Maggie. And you said things that hurt too, Margaret shot back. You called Robert a con man and a liar. You said I was being stupid and naive. You said I'd regret it and come crawling back and you'd have no sympathy when I did. Thomas closed his eyes. I remember. So when things got hard, when Robert died and I was left with nothing, how could I come crawling back? You told me that's exactly what would happen. Your pride wouldn't let me ask for help. My pride wouldn't let me admit you'd been right. Is that why you didn't write to me when he died? Thomas asked. I did write, Margaret insisted. 2 letters. I told you what happened. Told you about Lucy, told you I was struggling. I didn't ask for money or help, just connection, just family. And you never answered. Thomas turned to face her fully. I'm telling you the truth, Maggie. I never got those letters. 2 years ago, I was dealing with a bad winter, lost a lot of cattle, was focused on keeping the ranch afloat. Mail service was terrible that year, but if I'd gotten your letters, I would have answered. I would have sent you money. I would have told you to come home. Margaret searched his face, looking for signs of deception, but Thomas had never been good at lying. If he said he hadn't gotten the letters, he probably hadn't. So we've both been sitting here for 2 years, Margaret said slowly, thinking the other one didn't want contact, thinking we'd been rejected. Seems like it, Thomas agreed bitterly. The realization should have brought relief, but instead, it brought a fresh wave of anger. 2 years of unnecessary suffering, of loneliness, of assuming the worst about each other. 2 years that Lucy had spent in poverty, that Margaret had spent working her fingers raw, that Thomas had spent alone in this big empty house, all because of lost mail and stubborn pride. I'm still angry that you deceived me, Thomas said. When I saw that advertisement, when I read your letter as Mrs. Hartley, I thought I was getting a fresh start. No history, no complications, just a straightforward arrangement with a stranger. And then you stepped off that coach and everything got complicated again. Life is complicated, Thomas, Margaret said wearily. We can't have fresh starts. We carry our history with us wherever we go. I tried to run from mine when I married Robert, and look where that got me. So what am I supposed to do now? Thomas demanded. You've burned your bridges in Boston. You've come all this way. You've got a child to feed. Am I just supposed to take you in because we share blood? Forget about the advertisement. Forget about the mail-order bride I was expecting. Forget about my own plans and just accept that my sister has arrived instead? Would that be so terrible? Margaret asked, her voice breaking. Would it be so awful to have family again? To not be alone in this big house? To have someone to talk to share meals with, to watch leave again? Thomas interrupted. Because that's what you do, Maggie. You leave. What's to stop you from leaving again when things get hard? When you decide ranch life isn't what you want? When some other man shows up with pretty words and big promises? I'm not 18 anymore. Margaret shouted, her composure finally breaking. I'm not that foolish girl who thought love conquered everything. I've learned hard lessons, Thomas. I've been hungry. I've been cold. I've watched my daughter go to bed with an empty stomach because I didn't have money for food. I've sewn until my fingers bled trying to earn pennies. I know what real hardship is now, and I know what matters. What matters? Thomas asked, his voice softening slightly. Family, Margaret said firmly. Family matters. Lucy deserves to grow up with family, with roots, with a home that's actually a home. I deserve a chance to make things right with my brother. And you, Thomas Brennan, you deserve to not be alone anymore. You deserve to have people who care about you, who'll be there at the end of a long day, who'll make this house feel alive instead of like a tomb. The word tomb hit Thomas visibly. He looked back through the window at his house, seeing what Margaret had described. It really was like a tomb. Clean and functional, but completely devoid of warmth or life. I don't know if I can trust you again, Thomas said quietly. You broke my heart when you left, Maggie. I don't know if I can open myself up to that kind of hurt again. I broke your heart? Margaret's voice was incredulous. Thomas, you broke mine too. You were the only family I had. And when I needed you to support my decision, when I needed you to trust that I could make my own choices, you turned on me. You made me choose between you and Robert, and that wasn't fair. Life's not fair, Thomas said. No, it's not, Margaret agreed. Life is hard and messy and painful. But that's exactly why we need family. We need people who'll stand by us even when things are difficult, even when we make mistakes, even when we hurt each other." They stood in silence for a long moment. The sun had fully set now and stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. The night sounds of the ranch surrounded them, cattle lowing in the distance, horses moving in the corral, the wind whistling across the plains. "I can't promise to forgive you overnight," Thomas finally said. "I can't promise that this will work out, that we'll just slip back into being family like nothing happened." "I'm not asking for promises," Margaret said. "I'm asking for a chance. Just a chance to prove that I'm here to stay, that I'm not that foolish girl anymore, that I can be the sister you need and the partner in running this ranch that you were looking for." Thomas looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the determination in her eyes, the strength in her posture despite her exhaustion. This wasn't the young girl who'd left 15 years ago. This was a woman who'd survived hardship and come out the other side stronger for it. "One condition," Thomas said. "You work. I don't want you here as a guest or as some obligation I have to support out of family duty. If you stay, you earn your keep. You help run this house, you help with the ranch when needed, you pull your weight. I'll provide food, shelter, protection for you and Lucy, but in return you work. Deal?" Margaret didn't hesitate. "Deal." The first weeks were awkward in ways that Margaret hadn't fully anticipated. She and Thomas circled each other like wary animals, polite but distant, working together but not really connecting. They were two strangers learning to live under the same roof, except they weren't strangers at all. They were family, which somehow made everything more complicated. Margaret threw herself into work, determined to prove her worth. She woke before dawn to start breakfast, scrubbed floors that were already clean, mended clothes that barely needed mending. She organized the pantry, cleaned windows, and tried to bring some warmth to the cold ranch house. Thomas had said she needed to earn her keep, and she was determined to show him she was serious. But it was hard work, different from the sewing she'd done in Boston. The ranch demanded physical labor that left her muscles aching and her hands blistered. Hauling water, washing clothes without any of the conveniences she'd known in the city, cooking on a wood stove that had its own temperamental personality. She'd grown up on this land, but 15 years in Boston had softened her. She had to toughen up all over again. Thomas watched her efforts with a critical eye but said little. He'd leave for work in the morning and come back at dusk, covered in dust and smelling of cattle and sweat. They'd eat dinner in near silence, making stilted conversation about the weather or the cattle prices. Then Thomas would retreat to his room, and Margaret would clean up the kitchen, and they'd go to bed without having said anything meaningful at all. It was Lucy who started breaking down the walls between them. The little girl had been shy at first, intimidated by her uncle's gruff manner and imposing size. But children have a way of seeing past the rough exterior to the person underneath. And Lucy, bless her curious heart, was relentless in her interest. She started following Thomas around the ranch when she wasn't at school. At first, he tried to discourage it, worried she'd get hurt or get in the way. But Lucy was persistent. She'd trail behind him asking endless questions. "What are the cows' names? Why do horses need shoes? What's that bird called? Can I help feed the chickens? Why is the sky so big here?" Thomas, who'd lived alone for so long that he'd forgotten how to talk to children, was baffled by this small person who refused to be intimidated by his silence. But gradually, something in him softened. Maybe it was because Lucy reminded him of Margaret at that age, all curiosity and fearless energy. Or maybe it was simply that Thomas had been lonely for so long that even a child's chatter was welcome. One afternoon, Margaret looked out the kitchen window and saw something that made her heart swell. Thomas was teaching Lucy to ride, leading the gentlest mare around the corral while Lucy sat in the saddle, clutching the horn with both hands, her face a mixture of terror and delight. Thomas walked beside the horse, one hand on the reins, talking to Lucy in a patient voice Margaret could barely hear from the house. "That's it, just sit easy. Let the horse do the work. Don't pull on the reins, just hold them gentle. There you go. You're a natural." Lucy was beaming, her earlier fear forgotten. "Uncle Thomas, am I really doing it? Am I really riding?" "You're really riding," Thomas confirmed, and Margaret could hear the smile in his voice even if she couldn't quite see his face from this distance. When they came back to the house for dinner that night, Lucy couldn't stop talking. "Mama, did you see I rode a horse? Uncle Thomas says I can practice every day after school if I want. He says by spring I'll be good enough to ride out with him to check on the cattle. Can I, Mama? Please? Margaret looked at Thomas, who shrugged but didn't quite meet her eyes. Girl should know how to ride if she's going to live on a ranch, he said gruffly. Practical skill. But Margaret could see through the tough exterior. Thomas was enjoying this. He liked teaching Lucy, liked having someone to pass his knowledge to, liked being needed in this simple, uncomplicated way. That night marked a subtle shift. Thomas started talking to Lucy more at dinner, telling her stories about the ranch, about Wyoming, about the cattle business. Lucy would listen with rapt attention, asking questions that led to more stories. And Margaret, watching them together, would sometimes add her own memories from childhood. Uncle Thomas, tell me about when Mama was little, Lucy would say. What was she like? And Thomas, after a moment's hesitation, would share small memories. Your Mama was fearless, used to climb trees higher than any of the ranch hands dared, scared me half to death more than once. I fell out of that big cottonwood by the creek, Margaret would add. Broke my arm. Thomas carried me all the way back to the house. You weighed nothing, Thomas would say. Light as a feather. Cried the whole way, though. It hurt, Margaret would protest, and Lucy would giggle, and for a moment they'd feel like a family. The ranch hands noticed the changes. They'd seen Thomas hire them in the past, but they'd never seen him with family before. They watched as the boss started smiling more often, as his shoulders seemed less burdened. They watched as the ranch, house that had always been dark and empty in the evenings, now glowed with lamplight and occasional laughter. Jed Parker, the oldest of the hands who'd worked for Thomas for nearly 10 years, pulled Margaret aside one day when she was hanging laundry. Don't know what you did, ma'am, Jed said quietly, but the boss is different now. Better. He's been alone too long, working himself into the ground. It's good he's got family again. Margaret smiled, though her heart ached a little. We're working on it, she said. It's not easy, rebuilding what was broken, but we're trying. As the weeks turned into a month, then 2 months, the household found its rhythm. Margaret learned the quirks of the ranch house, figured out how to manage the wood stove, developed calluses on her hands that proved she was working as hard as anyone. She started making small improvements. Curtains for the windows made from fabric she bought with money Thomas provided without her asking, a few pictures on the walls. Flowers in jars during the brief autumn blooming season. Thomas noticed the changes but said nothing at first. Then one evening, he paused in the doorway and looked around the main room. Place looks different, he said. Margaret tensed, worried he was criticizing. If you don't like the curtains, I can take them down. Didn't say I didn't like them, Thomas replied. Just said it looks different, looks more like a home. It was a small comment, barely more than an observation, but to Margaret it felt like progress, like acceptance, or at least the beginning of it. One particularly cold evening after Lucy had gone to bed, Margaret and Thomas found themselves sitting by the fireplace with cups of coffee. The silence between them was more comfortable now, less charged with anger and old hurts. Do you remember, Margaret said quietly, when Papa used to tell stories by the fire? He'd make up the most ridiculous tales about the cattle talking to each other, planning elaborate escapes. Thomas's face softened with memory. The great cattle conspiracy. I'd forgotten about that. He'd have different voices for each cow. Old Bessie was always the ringleader. And Mama would pretend to be scandalized, Margaret continued, but she'd be laughing the whole time. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both lost in memories of parents they'd lost too young. I miss them, Thomas said finally. I think I missed them more after you left. At least when you were here we had each other. After you were gone I had nothing but memories. I'm sorry, Margaret said. I'm sorry I left you alone. I'm sorry. I chose Robert over... You didn't choose Robert over me, Thomas interrupted. I see that now. You chose your own life. You had every right to do that. I was just too hurt and too proud to understand it at the time. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. You were trying to protect me. I was, Thomas agreed. But you didn't need protection from living your own life, even if it meant making mistakes. Robert wasn't entirely a mistake, Margaret said softly. He gave me Lucy, and he taught me what real hardship was, which made me appreciate what real strength looks like. You were right about him not being reliable, but I don't regret the path that led me to where I am now. It brought me back home. Thomas nodded slowly. And Lucy is a good kid, smart, brave. She's got your spirit and your stubbornness. She's got your patience and your kindness, Margaret countered. She adores you, you know. She talks about Uncle Thomas constantly, about how you taught her to ride, how you know everything about the ranch, how you're the strongest man she's ever seen. Thomas looked uncomfortable but pleased. She's easy to teach. Listens well, doesn't complain. And she's got a natural seat on a horse. Give her a few years and she'll be a better rider than half the ranch hands. They fell into comfortable silence again, watching the fire crackle and dance. Outside, the wind howled across the plains, but inside, the house felt warm and safe, like a home should feel. Thomas, Margaret said hesitantly, thank you for giving us a chance, for not sending us away that first day, even though you had every right to be angry. Where would you have gone? Thomas asked pragmatically. You had no money, no home to return to, and Lucy needed a safe place. Still, Margaret insisted, you could have made it harder for us. You could have held on to your anger, but you didn't. You let us in even when it was difficult. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, I spent 15 years alone in this house, Maggie. 15 years of silence and solitude. It was inevitable that the town would find out the truth. Thomas had hoped to ease into it gradually. Maybe let people think Margaret was a distant cousin or some other relative. But small towns have big ears, and secrets don't stay secret for long. The first real test came when Thomas decided it was time to take Margaret and Lucy to the Sunday church social. It had been 3 months since they'd arrived, and Margaret had been quietly asking about attending church. She missed the sense of community, and Lucy needed to meet other children beyond the 3 she saw at the small schoolhouse. Thomas had been avoiding it, knowing what would happen once they showed up together, but he couldn't keep them hidden away forever. They were part of his household now, part of his life. It was time for the town to meet them properly. The church was a simple white building at the edge of town, with a small cemetery behind it and a community hall beside it where socials were held after services. As Thomas pulled the wagon up to the hitching post, he could feel eyes on them. Everyone was watching, curious about the woman and child who'd been living at the Brennan Ranch. Margaret had dressed carefully in her best dress, which wasn't saying much. It was clean and neatly mended, but obviously well worn. Lucy wore a simple dress that Margaret had sewn from fabric Thomas had bought, her red hair braided neatly down her back. Thomas had put on his Sunday suit, the one he wore maybe 3 times a year, and felt awkward and constrained in the formal clothing. Ready? He asked Margaret quietly as they climbed down from the wagon. As ready as I'll ever be, Margaret replied, though her hands were shaking slightly as she smoothed her skirt. Lucy, oblivious to her mother's nervousness, was excited. Is there really cake at church socials, Uncle Thomas? You promised there'd be cake. There's usually cake, Thomas confirmed. Now remember what we talked about. Be polite, don't interrupt the adults, and don't ask too many questions, Lucy finished dutifully. I know, Uncle Thomas. I'll be good. As they walked toward the church, Thomas saw Reverend Matthews approaching with his wife Patricia. The Reverend was a kind man in his 60s, but Patricia Matthews was known throughout the county as a woman who missed nothing and had opinions about everything. Thomas braced himself. Thomas Brennan, Reverend Matthews said warmly, shaking Thomas's hand. Good to see you. And these must be your guests we've been hearing about. This is my sister Margaret and her daughter Lucy, Thomas said, deciding to be straightforward from the start. They've come to stay with me at the ranch. Patricia Matthews's eyebrows shot up. Your sister? I wasn't aware you had any family, Thomas. In all the years you've been attending our church, you've never mentioned a sister. We've been estranged for some time, Margaret said, stepping forward with more confidence than she felt. I married young and moved to Boston. After I was widowed, I decided to come back to Wyoming, back to family. It was the truth carefully edited. Patricia's sharp eyes missed nothing as she took in Margaret's worn dress, her work-roughened hands, the way Lucy pressed close to her mother's side. "How convenient," Patricia said, her tone cool. "And when did this reunion occur?" 3 months ago, Thomas said, his voice carrying a warning edge. "Is there a problem, Mrs. Matthews?" "No problem at all," Patricia said, though her expression suggested otherwise. "It's just that we'd heard you were expecting a mail-order bride from Boston, and now you have a sister from Boston. Rather coincidental, don't you think?" The silence that followed was thick with tension. Thomas could feel the attention of everyone nearby, could sense the whispers starting to spread through the crowd. This was exactly what he'd been afraid of, but before he could respond, Margaret spoke up. "You're right, Mrs. Matthews, it's more than coincidence. I read my brother's advertisement in the newspaper. That's how I knew he was alone, that he needed family. So yes, I came here in response to that advertisement. I deceived him initially, and I'm not proud of that. But I did it because I loved my brother and wanted to come home." The honesty seemed to catch Patricia off guard. She'd clearly expected denial or embarrassment, not this straightforward admission. "So you answered a matrimonial advertisement for your own brother?" Patricia's voice dripped with scandal. "That seems highly improper, Mrs. Hartley," Margaret supplied. "And yes, it was unusual. But I was desperate, Mrs. Matthews. I was a widow with a child to feed, working myself to exhaustion in Boston, and I'd lost contact with my only living relative. When I saw Thomas's advertisement, I saw a chance to reunite with family. I took it. Perhaps it wasn't the most conventional approach, but desperation doesn't always allow for convention." "Desperation," Patricia repeated, and Thomas didn't like the way she said it. "So you came here seeking charity from a brother you'd abandoned years ago?" Thomas felt his anger rise, but Margaret squeezed his arm, silently asking him to let her handle this. "I came here seeking family," Margaret corrected, her voice firm, but not hostile. "And I'm not taking charity. I work for my keep. I run Thomas's household, I help with the ranch work, I earn my place. My daughter and I don't take more than we contribute. We're family helping family, which is what families do." Lucy, who'd been quiet until now, suddenly spoke up. "My mama works really hard. She gets up before the sun and she cooks and cleans and sews and never complains. And Uncle Thomas teaches me to ride horses and checks on the cattle and builds things and fixes things. We all work together because that's what families do." The simple declaration from a child seemed to shift something in the atmosphere. Several people in the crowd smiled. A few women nodded approvingly. Children, after all, rarely lied about such things. Reverend Matthews cleared his throat. "Well, I think it's wonderful that Thomas has family with him now. The Bible tells us that family is a blessing, regardless of how they come together. You're all welcome here." "Thank you, Reverend," Margaret said gratefully. But Patricia wasn't done yet. "Still, it does seem rather scandalous. A single man living with a woman, even if she is his sister." "People will talk, Thomas. Let them talk," Thomas said flatly. "Margaret is my sister. Lucy is my niece. They're living under my roof because that's where family belongs. Anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me directly." There was no mistaking the challenge in his voice. Patricia pressed her lips into a thin line but said nothing more. She wasn't fool enough to push Thomas Brennan too far in public. As they moved toward the church for services, Thomas could hear the whispers starting. Some people were sympathetic, others scandalized, most just curious. But Thomas kept his head high, one hand on Lucy's shoulder and the other gesturing for Margaret to walk beside him. During the service, Thomas noticed the looks. Some were friendly, curious glances from people who genuinely seemed interested in meeting his family. Others were more judgmental, like Patricia Matthews, who kept whispering to the women around her, clearly spreading her opinions about the scandalous situation. After the service, the real test came at the social. Tables had been set up outside with food brought by various families. There was indeed cake, as Thomas had promised Lucy, along with pies, sandwiches, and all manner of dishes. People gathered in groups, talking and laughing, but Thomas noticed how many conversations stopped when he approached with Margaret and Lucy. A few of the men came over to shake his hand, offering polite greetings to Margaret. The women were more divided. Some were welcoming, introducing themselves and complimenting Lucy's pretty dress. Others kept their distance, watching with disapproving eyes. Then Helen Crawford approached and Thomas relaxed slightly. Helen was a widow herself, ran a small farm with her 2 sons, and had always been practical and kind. She smiled warmly at Margaret. "Mrs. Hartley," Helen said, "I hear you've been running Thomas's household. I hope he's been treating you well. Men living alone tend to forget basic courtesies." Margaret laughed. "He's been fair, though I had to teach him that dishes don't wash themselves and floors need sweeping more than once a month." "Sounds about right," Helen said with a knowing grin. Then she looked at Lucy. "And you must be Lucy. My son Daniel is about your age. He's over by the swings if you'd like to go play." Lucy looked at her mother for permission. Margaret nodded, and Lucy ran off happily, finally getting to be a child instead of standing quietly by the adults. "Don't mind Patricia Matthews," Helen said quietly once Lucy was out of earshot. "She thinks it's her Christian duty to judge everyone. Most of us are just glad Thomas has family again. He's been alone too long, worked himself too hard. You being here is good for him." "Thank you," Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion. "That means more than you know." As the afternoon wore on, more people warmed up to them. The men appreciated that Thomas seemed happier, less isolated. The women who actually talked to Margaret found her to be hardworking and humble, not at all the gold digger some had whispered she might be. And Lucy's innocent charm won over everyone she met, running and playing with the other children like she'd always been part of the community. But the moment that truly turned the tide came unexpectedly. Patricia Matthews cornered Margaret by the dessert table, clearly not ready to let the matter drop. Thomas was across the yard talking cattle prices with some ranchers, and Patricia had waited until Margaret was alone. Spring arrived with a burst of green across the Wyoming plains. The harsh winter had passed, and with it, the last remnants of tension between Thomas and Margaret. 6 months had transformed the Brennan Ranch from a lonely bachelor's operation into a thriving family home. Margaret stood in the kitchen, which she'd completely reorganized over the winter months. New curtains hung at the windows, letting in the morning light. Shelves she'd convinced Thomas to build held jars of preserves she'd put up, dishes arranged neatly, small touches that made the space feel warm and lived in. The smell of fresh bread filled the air and coffee perked on the stove. She heard boots on the porch and smiled. Thomas and Lucy were coming back from the morning chores. Over the winter, Lucy had become Thomas's constant shadow whenever she wasn't at school. She'd learned to feed the animals, collect eggs, even help with basic ranch work. The thin, pale city child who'd arrived last fall was now sun-browned and sturdy, her laughter ringing across the ranch as she worked alongside her uncle. "Something smells good," Thomas said as they came through the door. He'd aged backward over these months, Margaret thought. The lines of loneliness had eased from his face. He smiled more, laughed occasionally, seemed lighter somehow. "Lucy gathered 8 eggs this morning," Thomas announced proudly. "Didn't miss a single nest." "I'm getting really good at it," Lucy said, carefully placing the basket on the counter. "Uncle Thomas says by summer I'll be able to help with the haying too." "We'll see about that," Margaret said, though she was smiling. "You're still only 8 years old." "Almost 9, Lucy corrected. "And Uncle Thomas says I'm strong for my age." Thomas caught Margaret's eye over Lucy's head and shrugged with a small smile. They'd had many conversations over the winter about how much responsibility was appropriate for a child. Thomas tended to think Lucy was capable of anything, while Margaret worried about her daughter growing up too fast. But they'd learned to compromise, to discuss things like parents would. Like family. After breakfast, Lucy headed off to get ready for school. Thomas would drive her into town in the wagon, as he did 3 times a week. Margaret used these hours alone to handle the heavier housework, to have time to think, to appreciate the peace that had settled over their household. When Thomas returned from town, he found Margaret in the garden she'd started planning. The ground was still too cold for most planting, but she was sketching out where things would go, measuring spaces, making lists. "Planning a big garden?" Thomas asked, coming to stand beside her. "I thought we could grow more of our own vegetables," Margaret said. "Save money, have fresher food. I used to help Mama with the garden when I was young. I think I remember enough to make it work." "I'll build you proper beds," Thomas offered. "Keep the rabbits out. Maybe put up a fence." "That would be wonderful," Margaret said gratefully. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, looking out over the ranch. It was these moments Margaret treasured most, the easy companionship, the lack of tension, The simple pleasure of being near family without any complications. Margaret, Thomas said suddenly, I've been thinking about the house. What about it? Margaret asked, turning to look at him. It's too small, Thomas said. With 3 of us now, we need more room. Lucy should have a bigger bedroom as she gets older. And you should have your own space, not just that tiny room off the kitchen. Margaret's heart squeezed. Thomas, we're fine. We don't need— I want to expand the house, Thomas interrupted. Add on 2 proper bedrooms and maybe a real sitting room. I've been saving money for years with nothing to spend it on. Might as well spend it on making this place a real home for my family. The word family still made Margaret emotional, even after 6 months. Are you sure? That's a significant expense, I'm sure, Thomas said firmly. Besides, I've been talking to Jed and some of the other hands. They'll help with the construction in exchange for some extra pay. We could have it done by fall before next winter sets in. Margaret didn't know what to say. The gesture wasn't just about adding rooms. It was Thomas's way of saying they weren't temporary guests, that this was permanent, that he was investing in their future together. Thank you, she finally managed. Thomas, thank you for everything. For taking us in, for giving us a home, for— You're my sister, Thomas interrupted gruffly, uncomfortable with gratitude. This is where you belong, both of you. That evening, as they sat around the dinner table, a ritual that had become sacred to all 3 of them, Lucy made an announcement. Uncle Thomas, I've decided what I want to be when I grow up. Oh? Thomas asked, his eyes twinkling. And what's that? A rancher, Lucy declared confidently. Just like you. I want to have my own ranch someday with lots of cattle and horses. Margaret started to protest, to say something about other options, about education, about opportunities beyond ranch life. But Thomas spoke first. That's a fine goal, he said seriously. But ranching is hard work, Lucy. It means early mornings and late nights. It means dealing with drought and disease and difficult cattle. It means sometimes losing money instead of making it. Are you sure that's what you want? I'm sure, Lucy said without hesitation. Because you make it look amazing, Uncle Thomas. You work hard, but you love it. I can tell, and I love it too. I love the horses and the open sky and the way everything smells after rain. I want to do this forever. Thomas was quiet for a moment, and Margaret saw something like pride flash across his face. Well then, he finally said, I guess I'd better teach you everything I know. Can't have you running a ranch without proper training. Really? Lucy's face lit up. You'll teach me everything? Everything, Thomas promised. How to manage cattle, how to handle finances, how to work with hands, how to deal with buyers. All of it. But you still have to focus on school, too. Smart ranchers need education. I will, Lucy promised solemnly. I'll learn everything. After Lucy went to bed that night, Margaret and Thomas sat on the porch as they often did now. The spring evening was cool but pleasant, and the stars were beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. Thank you for encouraging her, Margaret said. For taking her dreams seriously. Why wouldn't I? Thomas asked. She's smart and hardworking. If she wants to be a rancher, she'll make a good one. Her father would never have taken her seriously like that, Margaret admitted. Robert always had big dreams for himself, but he never thought about what Lucy might want or be capable of. Thomas was quiet for a moment. I never asked you much about him. About your marriage. But I've wondered sometimes if you were happy at all. Margaret considered the question. In the beginning, yes. Robert could be charming and exciting. But as time went on, as reality set in, I realized he was more interested in the idea of success than the work it required. He loved to dream but hated to do. And he never understood that I wasn't just his wife, I was also a person with my own thoughts and needs. Do you regret it? Thomas asked. Marrying him? Leaving here? I regret how we left things, Margaret said honestly. I regret the fight, the years of silence, the stubbornness on both our parts. But I can't completely regret Robert because he gave me Lucy. And the hardship I went through made me stronger, made me appreciate what really matters. Family, Thomas said. Family, Margaret agreed. I was so focused on independence, on making my own choices, that I didn't realize family wasn't a chain holding me back. It was a foundation holding me up. Thomas nodded slowly. I learned something too these past months. I thought being alone meant being strong. I thought needing people was weakness. But actually, Letting people in, trusting them, building something together that takes more strength than isolation ever did. We've both grown up finally, Margaret said with a slight laugh. Only took us until our 30s. Better late than never, Thomas replied. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars multiply across the sky. Inside the house, a lamp still glowed in Lucy's window. She was probably reading, reluctant to sleep, her mind full of dreams about ranches and horses and wide open spaces. You know what the strangest part of all this is? Margaret said suddenly. What's that? That advertisement you placed looking for a mail-order bride? It was supposed to bring you a wife, a stranger to start fresh with. Instead, it brought you back your sister and gave you a niece. Nothing turned out the way you planned. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice rough with emotion. I think it turned out better than I planned. A wife would have been a stranger, someone I'd have to learn to trust, someone who might have left if things got hard. But family, real family, they stay. They work through the hard parts. They forgive mistakes and build something lasting. He turned to look at Margaret directly. I never did get that mail-order bride. But I got something better. I got my family back. I got a home that's actually a home. I got a niece who makes me laugh and keeps me on my toes. I got a sister who I should never have let go in the first place. Margaret felt tears sliding down her cheeks. Thomas, let me finish, he said gently. I was angry when you stepped off that stagecoach. Furious, actually. I felt deceived and manipulated. But looking back now, I'm grateful. Grateful you had the courage to come home, even knowing I might reject you. Grateful you loved me enough to risk everything for a chance at family again. You saved me, Maggie.